We've been engulfed with stories of mass killings. According to research by the Institute of Security Studies, only 15% of murder cases in the country are actually solved.
Now, co-authors of the piece titled "Reducing Murder Must Be a Top SA Government Priority," Andrew Fall and David Bruce say this figure is a reflection of entrenched dysfunction in the SAPS. On the flip side, however, they suggest that there are solutions to this. Let's bring on David Bruce now virtually to unpack this. David, thank you so much. Always so good to speak to you or your colleagues and your colleague Andrew Fall as well, real experts in this field. South Africa's murder rate really spiking yet again for various reasons. In this piece you've written, on average 520 murders a week in South Africa during the 2022 calendar year. But your caveat is that determined, targeted policing can reverse this trend. Before we speak about what advice you have for the SAPS, what were some of the more specific important findings of this latest piece of research of yours?
Well, the main point is in some ways that the murder rate in South Africa has escalated quite considerably in recent years. So the murder rate that we have right at the moment is the highest that we've had in South Africa for 20 years. And it's possibly currently one of the 2 or 3 highest murder rates in the world, according to the information that we had access to. We could only find, actually, in fact, one other country which had a higher murder rate, identifiable murder rate than that in South Africa. So on the one hand, you've got very high levels of murder. On the other hand, you don't seem to have a clear recognition from government that we've got a very chronic, serious problem of, very serious violent crime of this kind. And government isn't responding to this problem in a purposeful way.
David, it's very interesting, the research that you've put out, because it indicates that police are making over 1 million arrests a year with crimes that are related to murder, and yet we're not seeing any fewer murders that are happening. Perhaps just juxtapose those two positions, that we are seeing the number of arrests that we do, but the levels of crime remain as high or get higher in the different quarters. If you could just break that down for us.
Right. Well, simply what it indicates is that policing isn't guided by a clear strategic or, information-based approach. So, police are responding to crime in a very sort of undirected, non-strategic kind of way. And so, they aren't, for instance, relying in an effective way on, available information about crime, aren't optimizing the use of crime intelligence or other information about crime to shape their responses to violent crime in an effective way.
David, I think specifically about the stories we've covered over the last 6 months or so. We know that there was a reportage about a number of mass murders in KZN, which has always been increasingly violent, and a lot of research has been done into that specifically. We've had a couple of mass murders in rural Eastern Cape as well. And then, of course, there are the so-called tavern killings, a spate of mass murders that took place at various taverns. I think it would have been late last year. You speak there of a lack of use of crime intelligence, because when we have those crime stats that come out every quarter, the various columns just get ticked. Oh, so many people were murdered, and this is the province that they were murdered in, and it was by a gun crime or that kind of thing. How should we be using crime intelligence? Because when you've got a spate of mass murders, like the tavern ones specifically, are police making enough of an effort to identify what the trend is, what is at the core, and not just bundling them together with other murders that they are recording in other parts of that same province?
Right. Well, I mean, you're raising a critical issue. I think, where we need to start with is that the Crime Intelligence Division of the SAPS has been in a state of chronic dysfunction for some time. It's a domain of policing in South Africa, which is shielded from any form of meaningful public scrutiny or even political scrutiny. So we don't really, we don't really know if anything really effective has thus far been done to address the chronic problems in the Crime Intelligence Division. And what we know is that, component of the SAPS has been overshadowed by internal conflict, by, as I've said, corruption and so on. So, the one issue that this highlights is then for, something much more, again, kind of purposeful, decisive to be done to strengthen and address the problems facing the Crime Intelligence Division of the SAPS.
David, you paint a bleak picture, and a few days ago, JJ Tabane, the anchor of Power to Truth, spoke to Minister Bheki Cele about the high levels of crime in the country, and the minister was quite confident that they were turning the tide in the SAPS, and he made an example using the rape figures, saying that these rape figures will be changing soon because we've cleared the DNA backlog, for example. But what you are reporting in this research paints quite the opposite picture. And so based on what you're seeing in terms of any activity happening within the different departments of the SAPS, whether it be forensics or otherwise, are you actually seeing some form of a turn in the tide when it comes to these violent crimes that are reported and investigated, and really just any sense that SAPS is changing in any way?
Yeah, my sense is that the improvements that are being made are at best piecemeal. My understanding is that government doesn't really understand or grasp the scale of the problem in the SAPS, that they are not responding to the overall policing challenge in South Africa in a systematic and purposeful way. And so, I think, for instance, it is the information that we have is that there have been, big steps made in addressing the backlog in terms of DNA, but there are multiple other facets of policing in South Africa at the moment where we aren't really seeing any real evidence of improvements. One of them would be the broad issue of crime investigation.
David, I'm quite intrigued by the synopsis of your research, because you do make the point that in some ways focusing on murder is, and I don't want to use this term, easier than just other crimes, because you point out here that South Africa's decade-long rise in murder is an exception to global trends. You also point out that in South Africa, 50% of all murders occur in fewer than 170 police station areas, predominantly over weekends. Surely this should make it easier for the SAPS to at least target what they know, what is in front of them, and somehow make inroads in that regard.
One would think so. Unfortunately, where, the situation that we're in right at the moment is one where, in some ways, what we have is a policing system which relies on a certain kind of formula, a certain kind of standardized repertoire of responses to the crime situation in South Africa. There isn't what we need is a different kind of I think one would call it strategic leadership from government and from the top management of the SAPS in order to focus in on critical challenges, critical problems facing the police, critical aspects of crime in South Africa, and respond to those issues in a far more kind of purposeful way, using the kind of information that we have on crime in a far more effective and purposeful way. But for instance, the current political leadership, the current senior leadership of the SAPS aren't making effective use of information on crime right at the moment. And in many ways, what we have is is policing in terms of a kind of standardized formula that's it's simply being reproduced over many years. There isn't any use of innovation, any effective. We're living in the information age, of course. But if one's looking at what's happening at the highest levels of the SAPS in terms of effective use of information on crime, of knowledge about the types of policing strategies that can be applied in order to turn these kind of situations around, there's very little of that kind of thing happening.
David, just in closing, you also spent quite a bit of time speaking about the need to focus on the people, the social sciences, the human sciences behind this very serious illness that South African society seems to have. And you point out that we need to always still focus on the people. You talk about civil society, religious organizations, community level organizations, sports teams, and how they need to be brought into the fold of this battle in putting out the message about where we can stem this tide of a really, really violent crime that's happening right on our doorstep. Why was that important for you and your colleague to point out in this piece of research?
Well, you see, for some reason which, one could understand, but in some ways what's happened in South Africa is that the problem of violence has in some ways become compartmentalized. So we have people consistently, in some ways raising concerns about one or other aspect of violence without having a concerted and focused response on the overall problem of violence in South African society. So we have this kind of ironic situation where we have a very high level of murder. We have a society which is supposed to embody principles of human rights, is supposed to embody principles of respect for human life. But we don't have any real engagement or concern with the overall fact that large numbers of South Africans are being killed every year in violent crimes of one kind or another.
Thank you very much for those insights. David Bruce joining us. He is the ISS independent researcher and consultant, speaking to us about research that he has done, Marcel, with his colleague there. And it's very scary. But one thing that comes across from that interview is that there are low-hanging fruits. Political will, an active SAPS, and providing the right resources. These are low-hanging fruits that they could literally reach for to turn the tide for many South Africans that live in fear.
Along with very real engagement at grassroots level. Because we see, every time we see Police Minister Bekele going into an area that's had a spike in crime, oh, we want the community on our side. We want the community to trust us because we can't battle this on our own. But you're not going to have that engaged relationship with the community if you're just going in there every time the cameras are there.
That's absolutely correct. One thing we must acknowledge, though, is the increased importance and visibility of community policing forums.
Absolutely. Even the President mentioned it in his State of the Nation address, didn't he?
They have really taken up the task to protect their communities, and they do a lot more than many of our police would do in many of the communities.
Absolutely.